So hello and welcome to today's Q&A session with the Greater Birmingham Chambers of Commerce on the implications of the conflict in Ukraine for local businesses. I'm Raj Kandola, Head of Policy and Strategic Relationships at the Chamber, and I'd like to welcome you to today's session. Now, of course, our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine and their loved ones the world over, whose lives have been utterly devastated by this crisis. At the Chamber, we're a leading business organisation helping members do business locally and globally. And throughout the coming weeks, and what we've been doing over the last couple of months, is working with our members to share the latest intelligence on the situation and support them in unpicking the implications for local businesses. We're working with our expert members and patrons to produce bite-sized briefing videos on resources on key areas like this today. And I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Dr. Steve McCabe, Director of Research at Birmingham City University, to discuss the energy crisis and how 2 months on from our original Q&A video, businesses are still being impacted. So Steve, thanks very much for joining us today. So since our last video, how has the situation in Ukraine affected the energy crisis we are currently experiencing in the UK?
Well, of course, we're 2 months on into a conflict, which, of course, it affects us all in many different ways. But as you indicated, our hearts go out to sort of the people of Ukraine. Who knows what the sort of the final death toll will be? We know that sort of millions have been displaced. So it's a sort of human tragedy on so many different levels. But of course, what we do also recognise is that Ukraine was a sort of, it's at the fulcrum, if you like, the sort of the East and West relationship, and we became very dependent upon Russia in sort of recent sort of years for sort of gas and oil. And what that has meant is, of course, that those disruptions. So, of course, when the conflict started with the invasion in sort of late February, we immediately saw a spike. Now, the view then was that this could be a sort of fairly short conflict, and so any sort of price rises were going to be temporary. Unfortunately, for all concerned, that is not the case, and so therefore, we see these sort of consistently high prices. For domestic users, that was already sort of calculated in by Ofgem in their price calculation. For industrial users and sort of for businesses, of course, they're not protected by the price cap, so of course they have to go with whatever the sort of the relationship is that they have with their supplier and the sort of the contracts they have. So obviously those who are on contracts, they may have sort of short to medium term protection, but longer term, I think we're looking at sort of energy prices remaining high. And coming back to sort of to the impact of Ukraine, we're going to see this conflict, it appears to me, rumbling on through the summer. So high prices will continue. Now, of course, the thing is, the summer gives a degree of respite because, of course, there is less requirement on sort of energy in all shapes, particularly for sort of domestic use. But of course, the sort of the business users do not have that. They continue working regardless. I think the sort of the big concern is that sort of if we go into the winter and supplies remain relatively low, then of course we may see prices going up again. As I say, because of course normally in the winter we all demand to sort of use more gas, electricity. So the medium term is not good. All we can hope, of course, is the conflict is resolved sooner rather than later, and we sort of get back to some degree of stability. But unfortunately, at the moment, that doesn't look particularly likely.
No, and you obviously mentioned that the UK government is committed to ending the country's dependency on Russian coal and oil by the end of this year, and ending import of gas as soon as possible thereafter. I mean, how do you think this will affect the UK's energy supply in the long term?
Well, I mean, the thing is, though, we're not a big user of sort of Russian gas, certainly in comparison to sort of other European countries, and some of them sort of well over 50%. So that they're, Germany in particular, that they are sort of, they've got a lot more to lose than us. We actually use a bit more oil, but of course, actually, that's mainly for sort of it's the sort of a different type of oil, but complicated. But it's used for sort of the diesel. Oil, strange enough, is easier to sort of to source from elsewhere because you can bring that in tankers. The gas tends to be sort of more difficult. The reality is, and of course it's always a bit complicated, that there is good and bad. Again, I was listening to something on Radio 4 a short while ago about inflation, and of course inflation, which of course you're probably too young to remember, in the 1970s spiked because of oil. And what that does, it's obviously sort of destructive. that there's a destructive effect in some ways, or economists talk about sort of price destruction. It means, of course, you have to sort of cope with it in the short term, but what it does, it makes you search for longer term solutions to sort of deal with it. And in the 1970s, we changed our relationship and thought about the use of sort of fuels. And then, of course, if I sort of say, even before Ukraine, we were talking about sort of the green economy, and therefore, of course, what this price spike will do, I think it's given us a real impetus to make that transition as soon as possible. I think we're still talking about years, but nonetheless, the sooner we can do that, the better. So I think the overall effect will be that we will become much more dependent, or much less dependent upon the use of the fossil fuels, and we'll look to greener solutions, which of course has got to be good for all of us in the long term, and it's good for the planet. And dare I say it, it's a much more effective way, if you like, of running our society. So it benefits all round, but nonetheless, of course, I do appreciate what it is doing is feeding into the inflation cycle, which of course businesses have to pick up, and they either pass it on to their customers, which of course is difficult, or they soak it up and they make less money. So I think that's the real concern I would have at the moment in the short term, that there are many businesses who are probably, I wouldn't say teetering on the edge, but of course, their margins are being cut anyway. And inflation, which of course reduces discretionary spending power, is going to have a big impact in the coming months.
Yeah, and particularly as you hint at there, just how reliant we are on consumer spending to fuel economic growth in this country. So in our last video, you discussed the need for businesses to be resilient and expect disruption. Obviously, you've hinted at that again, but 2 months on, I mean, do you have any other key messages for businesses right now?
Well, unfortunately, I mean, no, it is just the as much as possible, batten down the hatches and to try and seek whatever means are possible or at disposal to get through the next few months. I think the big concern is that maybe we'll see some stability over the summer, but again, who knows? As soon as you expect stability, it comes back to bite you, and something else happens. I think the big concern is that if we get through the summer and we get into the autumn and winter period, and if things are not looking hopeful at that point, and that the conflict continues to rumble on, I would say that my reading of the situation is that there's less willingness. I think the Russian people must be very tired of this, and I feel sympathy for them. Obviously, less so than the poor Ukrainians who are right at the sharp end of this. But I think that this thing is kind of losing momentum. But for us in the West Midlands coping with this, then we have to as I say, soak it up. So businesses, it's just a question of dealing with whatever is thrown at them. Survival, I think, is the key word. And of course, what we have to also recognise is that we're still in the throes of COVID. That's not gone away, and the numbers indicate that will be here for quite some time, and maybe forever. But again, it has less significance. We're still in the machinations of Brexit that's been dominating the news. So it's difficult all round. And as I say, I think people are going to be really squeezed. There are lots of dreadful stories. And let's face it, one of the issues that will affect businesses is the fact that 4 in 10 people are likely to go into fuel poverty. So their willingness and ability to go out and buy things is much reduced. So I think it's going to be a pretty tough time for the next while. And of course, as we're talking about, or as is being speculated, we're going to see inflation at 10% by the end of this year. Something we've not seen for 40 years. So shocks all round, and interest rates probably going up. It's a pretty pessimistic picture. But of course, as I've been around for a bit longer than some. If you can get through the crisis, there is always hope at the end. But of course, when we're in the crisis, it's difficult to have that degree of optimism.
No, I completely understand, and I think one thing that was clear, obviously, during the pandemic was just the resilience of the business community across Greater Birmingham. So again, a number of challenges on the horizon, but I'm sure they've got the tools and the spirit to try and get through. But Steve, thank you very much for that. Really appreciate that. To our chamber members watching, please do remember to keep in touch via your relationship manager on any questions you might have about the current situation and what you'd like to see in terms of lobbying points and advocacy from the chamber. Many thanks.